work for Global Focus, which is the Danish platform for NGOs, and we are super excited to be part of hosting this webinar together with other organizations. As you can see at the bottom here of our logo for today, we have Action for Sustainable Development, CAN, CIVICUS, Forus, ISHR, SID, TAP Network, and Together 2030. And so I just want to thank all of the co-organizers for coming together for this event. And I just want to let you all know that we will be recording today's webinar. And then I will also let you know that you're welcome to post any questions that you might have throughout the meeting in the chat. And you're welcome to post them also while speakers are talking, and then we'll get to as many as possible later. We have dedicated the last part of the webinar to really dive into those questions. And then I also want to importantly mention that there's translation. So anybody who needs French or Spanish translation, you can press the globe at the bottom that says interpretation, and then you can choose the channel that you will be needing. All right. Well, quickly, a short background on why we're here today. So almost a year ago, in the spring of 2020, when COVID had hit us all, and when UN meetings all of a sudden couldn't go on as they normally did, we came together as a civil society and did a joint letter in May of last year, where we really called on better inclusion and ensuring that civil society wouldn't be muted during the virtual events that would now take place at the UN. And so for that reason, we launched the campaign Unmute Civil Society. And this was also when 460 organizations from all over the world, from 115 countries, signed this joint letter to ask for meaningful inclusion of civil society at the UN in times of COVID. And this then resulted in really great leadership, especially from the Danish government and the Finnish government and other governments that made a pledge to ensure civil society participation at HLPF, the High Level Political Forum, last year in July. And so we had around 60 governments that signed that pledge. And I think it is really that momentum that we want to build on now, to have seen this great commitment from many governments, from many civil society organizations to ask for inclusive and meaningful civil society participation at the UN. And so this resulted in several events in the fall, and we have then now come together a group of organizations to try to host a series of webinars where we will look into how can this actually be done. And so this is the kickoff webinar, and I'm super excited for all of the very good speakers that we have today, and I really look forward to their insightful talks. And I think with that, I will pass on the word to Liza John, the Secretary General of CIVICUS, who will just give us a bit of a brief about the global situation for civil society, and especially the civic space situation in light of COVID-19.
Thank you, Sarah. Hello from Johannesburg, and a very warm welcome to everyone who's joined in from different parts of the world. Some of us on the panel were chatting just before the event started and recollecting a decade or more of work that we've done together, on the MDGs, now on the SDGs, and then of course, on the resilience and relevance of civil society all along. So it's just great to be back again with this really powerful group, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion that will follow as well. I'm just going to make 3 points to set the context of civic space in the light of COVID. One, 2020 was a phenomenal year, not just for humanity at large, but especially for civil society, because it almost single-handedly reinforced all of the arguments we've been making for decades, along in relation to the importance and relevance of civil society across the world, irrespective of which location we belong to. There's been numerous instances. In fact, we have an entire report called Solidarity During COVID, which documents hundreds of instances of civil society across its diversity. I mean, from local organizations to global organizations, playing really unique but also interconnected roles in progressing several levels of the COVID-19 response, across the globe. So this has not only been in relation to life-saving services, which have been organized at a staggering scale in countries. I come from India, and there's been media reports about how NGOs and civil society organizations have actually exceeded the response that the government itself was able to give in the first few months of the COVID pandemic. But in addition to that, we also saw civil society being the first to respond and fill in the gaps that were taking place in various locations in relation to the COVID-19 response itself. So this included responding to the rights of the most excluded groups in several societies. This includes the United States, Italy, and Japan. But it also, was really demonstrated to the kind of effort, very quick, spontaneous effort that we saw of groups responding to issues such as gender-based violence, such as mental health, services for a range of groups, such as the needs and the kind of unique needs of people with disabilities or LGBTQIA+ communities. And I think all of those areas where governments and the mainstream kind of response wasn't really meeting an immediate need, we saw local organizations, regional and global organizations step up and provide that support. And over and above that, we saw that groups were really acting quite quickly together, despite hugely restrictive contexts and the kind of imposition of emergency laws to almost in a way to as if to restrain the action of civil society. But you still saw groups coming together, playing a very, very important role in providing accurate and timely information to vulnerable groups like in Malawi or again in parts of South Asia and other parts of the world. And then also holding governments, being brave enough to stand up and hold governments accountable to how resourcing and decision making was happening in the light of the pandemic. So speaking up for civil society itself, but also speaking up for much wider communities that were being affected by the measures that were either introduced in the pandemic or the effects that were just being accelerated or reinforced as a result of the pandemic, but linked to a much stronger or a much deeper systemic injustice or kind of inequality that needed to be addressed. So the Black Lives Matter protest is a really stark example of that. You had the farmers' protest, which is still ongoing in India, and then you also had a number of reactions and protests in relation to the curbing of democracy, the shrinking of civic space across Europe, across Latin America, across regions. The African continent, in fact, saw the largest level of civic responses in relation to how elections were being manipulated or changed, as a result of the pandemic as well. So on every single continent, you had people stepping up, playing a really important role. It was almost, in a way, a dream come true for civil society, that the rights, the language of social justice, the language of climate action that we've been, talking about for decades, suddenly became a public and a household issue. And then once again, I think the WhatsApp debate that happened earlier this year was again a reinforcement of the fact that people do understand the nuances of how data is being controlled, of how their information is being used or exploited for commercial purposes, and a lot of complex issues which as civil society we found quite hard to articulate or quite hard to get public buy-in for in the past years. Has somehow quickly got infused into daily debates and daily dialogues, and I think people are really being able to make the connection between what's happening in their day-to-day lives and the longer-term change in line with social, economic, and climate justice that need to happen in order to make the shifts that we need to see across the world. So in that context, it's especially shocking and disappointing that governments have used the pandemic to further restrict civic space and civil society. The 2020 findings of the CIVICUS monitor, which were released in December last year, show that 87% of the population now lives in closed, restricted, or obstructed contexts, or where people are not able to exercise their civic freedoms clearly. A quarter of the world's population actually lives in closed contexts, which means that their civic freedoms can be routinely abused, and the ability of state and non-state actors to injure, intimidate, or even attack to the point of death, activists or citizens who speak out for their rights, is perfectly possible. And I think that's unacceptable in this time, and especially when we've just celebrated 75 years of the United Nations and called for a reinforcement of the commitment to people and power and human rights. So it's really an opportune moment, I think, now for us to be very, very strong, very, very vocal, despite all of the challenges we're facing, on a long-term agenda for civil society. I think we shouldn't be settling for short-term, knee-jerk, reactive responses to enable civil society to operate at a minimum level. We should be calling for, and this is one of the statements I've used quite a lot this year, it's a line from our State of Civil Society report, that a fully empowered, networked, and resourced civil society is a public good which every single country in the world requires. And I think we should just not have any, we should not give any ground away on that. I mean, that is something we need to really stand by. We have at least 30 examples from last year of especially local governments and civil society collaborating in ways which are really a systemic investment in civic space and civil society as well. So there are enough examples of how things can be done well, how communication channels or regulatory and financial systems can be also tweaked or changed or operated in a way that enables citizens to take action and enables civil society to operate. So in conclusion, I just want to say that the UN system has an especially important role to play in leading by its own example. And therefore, many of the proposals that emerged last year in terms of really ensuring that civil society as a stakeholder is strengthened and respected, and citizens at large are able to engage with the UN on a kind of an equal basis. They're not restricted by the governments or the countries that they belong to. And the voice of people, which is quickly connecting across countries, which is quickly reinforcing underlying themes of justice across locations, really is kind of heard well and clear in every aspect of the UN's work. I'll stop there, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Lisa. That was really great to hear. And I also wrote down the importance of now looking at the long-term agenda for civil society. And I think that's exactly also why we're here, right? To, yes, take this momentum and this also terrible situation that COVID has created, but exactly try and find ways that will maybe even improve also some of the long-term opportunities for civil society to be active. So thank you so much for that. That was really useful and very insightful. And so now I think what we will just do before we go on to the next speaker is, for those that have just joined, if we could please just go back to the program slide. I just want to quickly give you an overview of what will take place today. So now we've had this really great introduction from Lisa John, Secretary General at CIVICUS, and then we'll go on to hear a bit more about what is actually the situation at the UN. And after that, we have a really great reflection panel that will dive further into what are some of the things, both in terms of challenges and opportunities that we're seeing from the different experiences that they have in their work. And then we're very excited that the permanent representatives of Denmark and Costa Rica will also launch their recommendations on inclusive civic space at the UN later today. Then we will dive into also a Q&A session and really make sure that your questions that you can write in the chat throughout this webinar will be taken up. And then at the end, we'll look at next steps and how to get involved. So thank you so much, Lisa. And then now we will hand the word over to Stefano Prato. Stefano is the Managing Director of Society for International Development, and he will speak more about civic space at the UN, both looking at the situation before COVID, but certainly also during. So thank you very much, Stefano. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you. It's a great pleasure to share a few reflections here and also to meet again several longtime friends in this webinar. So let me first of all clarify that yes, of course, I am from the Society for International Development, but I will share some reflections here because of my role as coordinator of the Civil Society Financing for Development Mechanism and the major groups and other stakeholder coordination mechanism, which, as you know, now embraces 21 different constituencies, social right, older groups, social constituencies, regional mechanisms, and also thematic mechanisms in the process of follow-up and review of the 2030 agenda. So that is the particular vantage point that I will try and bring in this conversation. And I'd like to make 5 points here. The first one being slightly longer than the other, but very, very short and sharp. So first of all, when we talk about civil society participation, it's essential that we provide a proper context. I think Lisa was extremely helpful in providing the wider context globally in which this happens, but I'm going to zoom in primarily in the United Nations. So what is really the primary UN challenge today? What is the primary challenge of the 2030 agenda? When we ask these questions, we normally immediately get a lot of responses pointing out to the implementation challenge or the financing challenge. And I would like to, of course, recognize that these are important, but the real major challenge is a governance challenge in terms of both policy redirection as well as institutional redesign. In fact, COVID has really exposed the urgent need for significant rethinking in our frameworks at the micro, macro, and meso level. Certainly an urgent need for a new economic production model, a new social economy, the shifting of a center of gravity of many economies away from a global economy which is predatory in nature and in favor of vibrant, inclusive, ecologically sound social economic frameworks nationally. And in order to do this, certainly it's urgent to remove the systemic barriers to socio-economic transformation. Now, what has happened in the UN space, particularly in the follow-up and review, has really not to discuss these issues and these challenges. We places a lot of emphasis on progress at national level. And while that is extremely important, that focus made us blind to the systemic obstacles to progress. And the focusing on financing also made us blind to the reality of a net transfer of resources from the south to the north. So it's important to, as a general context consideration, to consider that we still live in a world where inequalities within countries, as wide as might be, continue to be trapped by inequalities between countries. And these traps are commodity traps, are debt traps, ecological and intergenerational traps, you know, and without really recognizing that we need to tackle this global division of labor and change the current pattern of globalization, its patriarchal nature, its disregard for planetary boundaries, and the extractive nature of global finance, is very difficult to generate any progress. So it's important to have this context of reference, because if we frame the UN challenge as a policy challenge, as a governance challenge, as a challenge to reframe the capacity of the UN as an institution and as a space to provide responses to these systemic challenges, then this takes to my second point, which we need to clarify what is the role of civil society in that particular context. Now, with respect to this, it is essential, as Lisa also mentioned, that we reaffirm unambiguously the legitimate right of participation. And this legitimate right of participation is very often challenged. But we also need to reframe it from a paradigm of, I can say, physical space to one of policy space. Far too much and far too often, civil society participation is framed in terms of number of interventions, number of participants, number of minutes of participation. This is a theatrical form of multilateralism that does not allow us to tackle the challenges that I've introduced before. The reality is that we need to step beyond this virtual choreography and really be able to engage in policy decisions. And in order to do this, we need to be involved at every step of that process. We need to be involved in the design of the particular meetings, events, review sessions, expert group meetings, HLPF, and everything else. And we need to be engaged in the actual process of negotiations. So it's essential to reject the notion that is all about numbers, it's all about minutes, and it's all about showing up on a program. In some respect, we may even not do that. I'm not suggesting that, of course, but the essence is our capacity to convey the proposals for systemic reforms and systemic transformation of the world we want to see materializing into the entire stages of the process. And right now, that opportunity is simply not there. We have very limited space for engagement in negotiations. Tends to be marginal participation at best at the end, tail end of the discussion. We often do not have disclosure of documents, and we tend to be seen purely as, you know, choreographic additions of a few social groups in a participants list. Inclusion without equity is a social bribery, and we do not have to accept that bribery in order simply to have our feet into the room, whether they are virtual or physical. So my main argument here is that we really need to reframe our participation away from these sort of tokenistic choreographical elements and demand a seat into the policy discussions in which we will convey our proposals and the actual substance of our transformative potential as civil society. Now that takes me to the third point, which is the fact that in this context, the conflation of civil society within stakeholder participation is problematic. Words have meaning. And I think we've given up far too early in recognizing that right holder participation into a human rights framework is profoundly different than stakeholder participation. And the fact that we allow in the same pot social groups who legitimately claiming for rights and other societal constituencies who come to claim their own interests into the process is problematic. And this is where we really need to problematize much more than we've done as civil society, the importance of multi-stakeholderism, because multi-stakeholderism is going to be a principal obstacle to that policy redirection away from that corporate dominance that currently shapes the current model of hyperglobalization. And this is where we see, you see, if we are interested not in choreographical participation, and we're really interested in policy change, multi-stakeholderism is a much bigger issue. Sometimes we stepped into multi-stakeholderism purely because it allowed us to be in the room as well. You know, so the conflation of civil society within this model has to be challenged. My fourth and super quick point is that if we look at it this way, this context, the need to reframe our participation in terms of policy change and therefore challenge who else is at the table, then we also need to be a little bit more demanding from our partners. Because sometimes some of the member states that have promoted our participation are actually the first ones that do not want that policy discussion in a UN context and actually propose actively the paradigm multi-stakeholderism. So my sense is that we need to make this conversation not only into intergovernmental space, but also in active discussion with those partners that actually are willing to see us increasingly at the table. And to conclude, sometimes when people think about systemic reforms, immediately they think that this goes into the long term. Well, I want to disagree with that. We have a need for immediate short-term decisions. Affirming health as a global public goods means improving, taking decision, for instance, on the TRIPS waiver, implement a moratorium on investor-state dispute settlement mechanisms. It means to take firm decisions in the UN context on debt sustainability to allow resources that are currently in the South to stay there to deal with the immediate needs, and much more. So what I'm saying is these policy decisions are not about a future long-term transformation. We need them now, and we need a civil society to engage into the space, having very clearly that we are there not to show up and add some folklore to the room, but really challenge current political economies and promote policy transformation. That's the kind of civil society participation that we need, and that's the one that has really closed up a lot over the past years. I think we need to step up and change this significantly. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Stefano. I really appreciate your very strong recommendation there also for us in civil society, exactly to look at what we can also be part of. And I'm very happy that we'll get a chance to speak more about that today, and also see how governments also propose that we can collaborate on this. So thank you very much, Stefano. And Stefano, of course, besides from being the managing director of Society for International Development, also had a very important role today also in his capacity in the Major Groups Coordination Mechanism. So thank you so much for that perspective, Stefano. And now I am excited to move on to our reflection panel. And so basically we have invited 4 really insightful people to bring in their reflections on some of the things that have been said now, but also looking at it from some different perspectives. And so we will have sort of 4 rounds that'll be kicked out off with some questions that I have for the panelists. So I very much look forward to hear all of your inputs. And just to briefly introduce the panel, we have Rosalind Kihumba, who is the International Regional Policies Coordinator at Help Age International, and it's also in the NGO Major Groups Africa. And then there's Annie Namali, who is convener of Wadanatodo Abiyan. Then we have Oyebisi Olise, who is the Executive Director of Nigeria Network for NGOs and is also here today representing Forus. And then we have Lina Dabak, who is the Head of Political Advocacy at Climate Action Network. So I'm sure all of your different perspectives will really bring in some interesting reflections on how civil society at the moment is muted in some UN processes, and also how we can improve it. So first of all, I would like to ask Rosalind a question. So Rosalind, if you would please be okay to reflect on the regional challenges regarding civil society participation and inclusion at UN meetings, that would be really great. And then the other panelists will also have a chance to respond to what you share. So thank you so much, Rosalind, for kicking off sharing insights on that question.
Thank you very much for this great opportunity. I'm one of the 3 co-chairs supporting the African Regional Mechanism for Major Groups and Other Stakeholders, which was officially launched early 2020. And the mechanism facilitates coordination and coherence in terms of us engaging regional and global events. And our secretariat is supported by ECA. And I will kick off by just noting that the virtual meetings that are being organized by UN have really increased our participation. But again, because of the digital divide, because especially in Africa, where the technology is still low, particularly in the rural areas, we have issues around accessibility and affordability, and there's need for more education on this. And further, even after we access this meeting, that does not necessarily mean that for sure we are participating, because participation allows opportunities for us to have adequate time to contribute to the discussion. And even further, this is compromised by the fact that the UN meetings have now been shortened. So meaning that then less time for member states to speak, and even shorter time for us to engage as stakeholders. And we have noted that, for instance, we as major groups, in terms of preparing the regional forums, the civil society are just invited to provide feedback on the documents or suggest, aspects, but they are never part of the organizing committee. And this is really not working for us, because we are not at the table, and there is no established multi-sectorial or sectorial mechanism for implementing, monitoring, and reporting the implementation of SDGs and Agenda 2063 here in Africa. And if it's there, then our civil society are not there as part of the mechanism, and it's something that we need to really push to ensure that it's part and parcel. And all the other experiences of all the organized African Forum. Now we are headed for the 7th forum. Our major groups have just been given slots, one slot to present their key messages. And we think that this is not according to what we had agreed and what was agreed during the adoption of SDGs, that we should be part and parcel of the implementation, domestication, and all that. That means then civil society just provide, contribution or perspectives or messages which are not necessarily taken seriously. And this means that we are just seen as not as a key stakeholder in the process. And we think this needs to change urgently. But even further, the contribution, most of the vulnerable groups are usually in remote places, meaning that we are not able to, UN is not, UN system has not been investing much time, particularly to build their capacity, those areas, civil society in those particular areas, so that they can be able to contribute to SDGs implementation, but also participate, because also the funding slots are very few. So meaning that it will just give a few number of civil society who deserve to be at the table, and only the well-funded partners or civil society are able to participate. And we have seen that there is no purposive support from a UN system to actually broker relationship between the civil society and the government, particularly at a national and subnational level. And further, there is no, very few countries like Kenya have the multi-sectorial mechanism that actually put civil society at a higher level in terms of the roadmap and implementation roadmap of SDGs. And another point is around the fact that the major groups are also excluded in a number of sessions that are very critical. For instance, around VNR and Leave No One Behind. And this is a place that we really need to check out, so that the major groups are involved. In conclusion, what we may need to do is to ensure that UN stays committed to what they had said, that they will develop a partnership a mechanism that is multi-stakeholder and multi-sectorial, so that we are able to participate as equal partners, and also to ensure that we are sustaining collaborative activities throughout the year, not just during Africa forums or high-level political forum. And further, these mechanisms must be well funded. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosalind. I've been writing down a lot of things. It was really great to hear both the challenges and also some recommendations. I'd like to hear if any of our other panelists might have anything to add here from one of the regional perspectives that you're from. Maybe Annie, would you have something to add here from the regional and national perspective that you're from?
Thank you, Rosalind, for a very detailed process on how the regional mechanisms work. We belong to the Asia Pacific Regional Mechanism, and I would say as a regional mechanism, we are quite robust. In the sense, there are a number of subgroups within the Asia Pacific Regional Mechanism. There is a whole secretariat that really works day and night, coming up with documents, with responses, with position papers on almost every dimension that you can talk about. So as a civil society forum, we are very robust and very well up to date on the various discussions. But again, like Rosalind said, when it comes to actually participating with the government, there's very little space. Even the last meeting that we had, you get 1 or 2 slots of 2 seconds and 2 minutes and things like that. And in the end, it depends on the chair whether that slot is given or not. So what I would say is that whole knowledge and that whole concerns get lost out, because it then becomes only between the government and the UN mechanism that is being created. So I think it is a common thing that while there is a lot of potential in the civil society mechanisms at the regional level, they don't really get integrated into the knowledge system and the strategy system of the UN as we are looking at SDGs. I think really we will have to have a greater space, a greater time, and participate in various processes, because it's not just for the name of participating. We have really concerns and strategies that need to be brought into the process of a sustainable future that we are looking at. So I would sort of say that APRSEM, while being very robust, still has its challenges in contributing to the process.
Thank you so much, Annie. That was really good to hear as an add-on also from a different regional perspective. Please do turn on your video so that we can all see you for when you speak next time. That would be wonderful. Thank you so much. And also the same to Lina and Oyebisi and Rosalind. You're welcome to just have your video on for this entire panel discussion so that you don't have to turn it on and off every time you speak. Thank you so much for that. And thank you for really great insights from both Rosalind and Annie. Oyebisi or Lina, would you like to add on at this point, or should we move on to the next general question?
Thanks, Sarah. Not at this point, because they're much better panelists who can speak to the regional perspective than myself.
No problem, Lina. Thanks. Oyebisi, do you have something to add?
So I think mine is just to say that, can you hear me? Let me check my mic first to be sure you can hear me.
We can. We hear you perfectly and we see you. Thank you.
Okay, brilliant. I think mine is to say that while we have these challenges, it might be good that we explore how scientific we can be, meaning that we do have a civic space ranking now that is done by CIVICUS. Can we be scientific and evidence-based as to how this space is closing within the UN, and then start tracking that year on year, such that we can look at where have we made gains, in which of the mechanisms are we making gains? And in which of the spaces or mechanisms are we not making gains? And we can provide this evidence to the UN on an annual basis. And this helps our advocacy in terms of keeping that space open. I just thought I should flag that.
Very nice suggestion. So maybe the CIVICUS monitor could add on a, a tag for civic space at the UN. Thank you so much for that, VC. That's a great idea. Okay, so now I'm happy to then move on to the next question for the panel, which Annie will kick off. And the question is just to speak a little bit about the inclusion of civil society at the UN in light of Leave No One Behind. So Annie, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I mean, to start off with, I think the whole concept of Leave No One Behind is a pretty relevant, valuable concept, because unlike a generalized development paradigm, we are talking of a paradigm where we are talking of vulnerable communities. We are talking of reaching them first. It's just not that they will be reached, but that we should reach them first, and resources need to be directed towards them so that they have a greater ratio of growth compared to the national averages. That's the kind of a framework in which this is framed. So I think to have that as a framework is a great thing. And that whole idea is not something that we often hear about. But again, we don't want to limit this to a charity and a paternalistic kind of a framework where we say, okay, we just include them. But I think I would go very much with what Lisa and Stefano said about rights and justice being at the foundation of that inclusion, participation, empowerment, rights and justice. So as a framework, I think it is very good, and many of us have been using that framework, particularly in a country like India, where you have large population groups that are socially excluded, vulnerable, poor, disadvantaged communities, historically disadvantaged, continuing to live in hard to reach areas. So you have a whole lot of, it would be more than 50% of the population that suffer from one or the other of these disadvantages. So it's not like a small population, but it is huge populations. And I'm sure there are similar populations in every country, because the whole process of our social systems and structures ensure that there will be communities or individuals that get left behind. So I think the reality of vulnerable communities, those that will get left behind, is a reality that we all face at some level or the other. So in that sense, it's a universal concern. And it is key to the whole idea of sustainability, of a sustainable future. And I think the knowledge and the perspectives and the concerns of these communities need to be brought into the center stage for creating the sustainable future that we are talking about. So it's very important that we have this dimension in the whole process. But in many ways, I would say that this is not a serious agenda either for the UN or for the countries, because while there are many concerns that the UN has, and there is some level of concern on the Leave No One Behind dimension, but I don't somehow see that as driving the agenda. I don't see adequate work being done on that part to really create a framework, to support a framework, to put resources into that kind of a framework to move forward. So I think in some ways, I would say it's something of going into uncharted waters, because we are familiar with other dimensions of development in terms of poverty eradication or nutrition or, sectoral dimensions that we are familiar with, but to look at a whole process of a social exclusion, a whole process of vulnerability and the way it recreates itself, I think we're still very unfamiliar with it. And the challenge of this is also that it is not a one-dimensional process. It's a multi-dimensional process. Communities are not left behind because they are poor alone, or communities are not left behind because they're illiterate alone. They are left behind through a complex process of power, historical disadvantages, existing discrimination and biases against them, the inability to access public services, the inability to access justice. So it's not that these communities can be supported by a one strategy. It's a much more complex kind of a thing, and we need to work together around it. Another way I think is that these are again not homogeneous communities even within a country. There are multiple communities, and within each of them there are multiple communities. That we talk of gender, but in India we have initiated something what we call the 100 hotspots. The idea was to identify very vulnerable communities and to have evidence to look at where they are in terms of the SDGs. So we are actually tracking the inequality between these communities and the national development progress. And this has really given us, more and more inroads into, like, say, when we looked at gender, we started looking at single women. We started looking at sexual minorities. We started looking at sex workers. We started looking at domestic workers. I mean, so just that, and then you have ethnic groups of women, you have, urban poor women, you have Dalit women. So there is so many multiple sub-communities who are highly unequal even within these communities. So if we are talking seriously of the whole leave no one behind idea, we will need to go down to that community level and be able to track those communities and see how they are able to access and have a more inclusive development. And I think in all our countries, there are governance mechanisms, like there are governance mechanisms at the local level, there are governance mechanisms at the subnational level, there are governance mechanisms at other levels. So it is possible to track, but somehow the will and the mechanism, the intent to track those, indicators are really not there. And indicators wise also, I don't think we've got a comprehensive indicator list of what are the indicators that we would track under all these 17 goals and targets. So I think much more work needs to be done. And secondly, what I see with the government is that government data is highly metadata. It sort of talks national or subnational, but does not really go below that. And here you would need data of these communities specifically, disaggregated data, where community is able to track the data. And there are a lot of examples at this point in time where community is able to do that, but there needs to be a robust interface between the government data and evidence systems and the data and evidence systems that the community is able to track. Here, I would say that civil society has an edge and an advantage, because civil society by and large has a focus on vulnerable communities or vulnerable sections of the communities. We are located within these communities to quite a large extent. And you also have civil society organizations from within these communities who have a lived experience of these issues. So it is that there is a lot of potential, there is a lot of knowledge, there is a lot of strategies and sustainability. Actually, a lot of civil society that work with vulnerable communities are sustaining there for years and years. So it is a good set of mechanisms that we can use to engage with the community. I think UN has a role to be a compass to put the leave no one behind dimension into the SDG more strongly and in a more focused manner. And now that we are talking of about a 10-year decade of action, can the UN really have a kind of a working group that could take this agenda, build its indicators, build materials, mechanisms, have consultations with civil society, bring in this knowledge into the process. So I think UN needs to do a lot more on grounding this principle of the leave no one behind and create better mechanisms. I think it has started an initiative in the 2020 VNR, because almost every country had a section on the LNOB. communities in their country report. But of course, it's like, you know, just as all countries come and report, it was a very simple recognition of these communities. So I think it needs to go beyond that. Country offices can create an interface between the government and civil society, and every UN does talk, country offices does talk about vulnerable communities. If you would see, there's a UN Women that works, there is UNICEF that works on children, there's somebody else that works on elderly and youth. So, but again, these are being worked at a very meta level. So how does these country offices really work with civil society organizations with the focus on the further vulnerable communities and work towards them? And I think at a global level, pushing the community disaggregated data and evidence would go a long way in highlighting and placing these communities at the center of the discussion. I'd maybe stop here, and then we can, you know, take further thoughts on this.
All right, thank you so much, Annie. You really covered a lot of very important points and also recommendations. I appreciate that. Would anyone else like to just come in for a short comment or reflection about Leave No One Behind in this space? Rosalind, I see you unmuted. Yes, please go ahead. Quick note though.
Yes, very quick. It was quite comprehensive, and what I wanted to add is around the need, because the changes that are needed in terms of Leave No One Behind requires changes in policies and legal framework. And this, I think, is one of the areas that is really denying the Leave No One Behind to shoot off and move. And for us, like older person, we don't have any legal framework, and most of the national governments do not have policies around older person, and that is also reflected in other vulnerable groups like homeless. So it's really important that maybe more effort is put in also accelerating the transformation or establishment of or development of new policies and legal frameworks. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosalind. Really good point to add. All right, I think we will move on to the next question, if that's all right. And this question is addressed to OEBC. And OEBC, I'd like to ask you what your view is on the challenges and opportunities regarding civil society participation, particularly at the UN in times of COVID. So looking into the virtual meetings, what are your reflections on how that has actually worked?
So in terms of my reflections around this, I would situate it around the lessons that I think COVID has taught us. One is the fact that no one sector has all the answers and the resources, but to also bring in the context of Leave No One Behind. By and large, the nonprofit or the civil society sector has been left out of, you know, the decision making or the processes or the measures that we have in being able to address the pandemic. And I situate it this way: the government has a role of providing the enabling environment. The private sector is seen as a driver of the economy, and as such, they provide resources and they bring money to the table, in quote. Civil society most times is seen as noisemakers, whereas that noise helps in setting agenda, in shifting policies, and also in shaping public opinion. Now, having said that, in being able to participate within the UN processes itself, there are both opportunities and there are both challenges. One of the opportunities is that usually before you can travel to the US, you are looking for grants for you to travel. There are conditions for you to do that. And, you know, at the end of the day, you're not able to even access majority of all the meetings. But with COVID now, we can all sit in the comfort of our houses or our rooms and offices and join some of these meetings. However, there's a challenge of you being able to connect and connect meaningfully. Affordability of internet is a big trouble. Not all organizations can afford sitting in front of a laptop and connected to the internet for long hours, because data or internet connection in different parts of the country, the cost itself could be prohibitive to many organizations. So while there's the cost around the opportunity of us not looking for money to travel in terms of tickets or in terms of running after your visa, there's now the opportunity of being able to reach a larger audience using the internet. However, affordability is also a big problem. And where you can also afford, there's the issue of meaningful connectivity where your internet is dropping and you can't even put on your video for long hours. The other sense and the other reflection I would like to bring to this conversation is also the need for civil society itself to now invest in resources that could help it to engage with UN processes and systems. And I keep saying to myself, if we've said we will leave no one behind, there's a commitment I must also have as a sector, as an organization, and as an individual, not to allow myself to be left behind. And it is within this conversation or this principle that I would like to also situate my conversation around looking at the major groups. Yes, we have opportunities for engaging through the major groups. However, how are we also running those major groups in ways that opens up that space for those local players that want to play, for them to come on board? Of course, understanding that not everyone understands the relationship between their local organization to the work that is happening at the global level. And when you look at the dynamics in terms of what happens between the northern and southern NGOs, sometimes you find southern NGOs more interested in networking, while the northern NGOs are more looking at issues of policy, lobbying at the global level to get things sorted. We have to balance this because we also need the numbers. When you also look at the processes, they are closed processes where only very few people can attend those meetings, and there are a lot of parallel events happening. And you then marry that and say, what is the essence of this parallel meeting to the closed spaces where we can actually put agenda on the table and advise our government? So while there are these opportunities for us to engage, we must find ways of expanding them. And in expanding them, we need to also think through, like I said earlier, which of the mechanisms has worked for us, which hasn't worked, and how do we review them in ways that, again, helps us to be able to engage and engage meaningfully. Of course, we could say that space is shrinking, but what is the contribution of civil society to also shrink that space? There's always infighting sometimes within some country delegations. The major group itself, its processes of selecting who does X, Y, Z sometimes has been challenged. So we need to look at our own reforms in ways that helps us to also hold others accountable. And with COVID, yes, we can reach more civil society organizations, like I said earlier. If 50 people were meant to travel, now we can do 1,000. But even the 1,000 that we can do, there's also that challenge of being able to afford to connect to the internet. Again, the stereotype as to how we are seen and perceived as a sector is also a huge one that we need to now pay attention to. And COVID would also exacerbate that. And I'll tell you why. The chances are, and this is me just speculating, that if there needs to be a physical gathering, the chances are private sector and government will be prioritized as against civil society. So do civil society have to be in the room? Yes, they need to be in the room. Should they be in the room physically? Then there will not be some debate and decision and say, no, they don't have to be in the room physically. I think we need the private sector in the room physically. We need government in the room physically, and maybe private civil society can join virtually. Or you're then again looking at, okay, XYZ can't come in, XYZ can come in terms of resources. So these are some of the conversations that would now happen going forward in terms of the measures, one, to curb COVID and to reduce large gatherings, but also in terms of how we are perceived in terms of our role and our ability, plus also how we have been prioritized within government thinking. So if there's a government that doesn't like our face, then we are moved to online. I'm assuming, again, it hasn't happened, but I'm just projecting. If there's a government that likes us, then they want to bring us into the room. these are conversations that we need to look at, and I think we do also have to be scientific about it. One, look at which of the spaces are closing, find ways of opening them. Two, look at what we are doing as civil society to cross the space ourselves. What's our national processes like in terms of opening up spaces for others to come in? How do we ensure that information flow? How do we ensure that we build the capacity of others to be able to engage? And now that COVID has shown us that we will now need to use technology, how are we going to ensure that civil society organizations have access to meaningful connectivity? Internet is affordable and accessible, and we can also play within that space of ensuring that our voices get to the UN, and it shapes agenda, it sets that agenda, and it shapes public opinion. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Oyebisi. That was really great to hear all of those different points, looking at various aspects, but also really concrete recommendations. So thank you for that. So now I'd like to hear if any of the other panelists would like to reflect a bit further on what Oyebisi said, or anything you might want to add on this point on the virtual meetings. Lina, I see you unmuted. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I very much would like to add, but I think I will do that as part of my intervention. So to give others the space maybe to reflect first, and then I can do that as part of the reflection in the end, based on the question as well that you will pose to me.
No problem. All right, we'll do that, Lina. Thank you. So Rosalind and Annie, would you like to add anything to Oyebisi's comments on this area of virtual meetings? Annie, I see you're speaking, but you need to unmute, please. Sorry.
What we had is, to some extent, it opened up for India, because we do have a fairly, I mean, at least 50% of our country have an internet connections. So it opened up and brought in many more people this time into the virtual space, but then again, only as observers again, and you don't have translation, because, you have only French and Spanish and other, you don't have Hindi and other languages. So it sort of opened up the space a little bit, but then participation and knowledge building was limited. At the national level, then it got left to the national organizations to further try and connect to people. But at the UN itself, I think the time and the space was very, very limited.
Thank you very much, Annie. Rosalind, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, and the fact that we had increased number of civil society participating, meaning that we had a more amplified voice for civil society, and it's something that we may need to take advantage, and especially the visible articulation of what needs to take in place, particularly in terms of investments around a civic space, around also social, social sector aspects that came out as a great need at community level. It's something that we may need to take advantage so that it catalyzes our contribution in building back better or in SDGs. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rosalind. All right, so now I think we will move on to the last reflection question, which is addressed to Lina. And basically the question goes, what your perspective is on the difference of civil society participation at various UN meetings. It might vary, that in some meetings it's possible to participate in certain ways, in others other ways, or maybe it's more limited. And of course, I'd also appreciate if you'd input with some of the things you mentioned before. So thank you so much, Lina. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks, everybody, actually, for being on the panel with me, for the great inputs, really good food for thought, and many of the discussions that, you are having in different UN spaces, we also have within CAN. I work for, Climate Action Network International. That's the secretariat of the largest.
Jani has been sympathetic to it. So basically 12 countries that would have...
Sorry, we just need to mute the ambassador. Sorry. Is that Ollie?
Climate change and its effect on security is clearly on the agenda of the Security Council. The problem was with China and Russia that they don't like this comprehensive approach.
Ollie, do you hear me? Would you be able to?
I'm trying to find. Oh. There we go. I think we have it.
It worked. Wonderful. I appreciate your help, Ollie. Thank you so much. All right, back to you, Lina.
Talking about the same issue, climate change issue, as one of the really important topics. So, yeah, just to say, we work in the UNFCCC, which is the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. I heard many of the panelists actually engaging more, in the high-level political forum, and then obviously many of you who are on the call trying to do advocacy in different UN processes. So I just thought, like, before going into your question, Sarah, it might be good, to also share an initial reflection. I think it's really interesting, like the moment of time, like we are having this discussion, and I think that is, it's because of the pandemic. I think like we have more time, and we have a realization, maybe as people who work in the UN space, who have experience like doing lobbying at the UN, working with governments face to face, that last year all these opportunities were actually lost for us. And I think that also made us reflect on how meaningful actually our participation was or is, because if you rely on being physically there, like to have a chat with a delegate, I think that is already like a problem. And I think that builds a little bit on what Stefano also said, like what access really means for us, and like how we actually participate in decision-making has been challenged, I think, by this whole pandemic. And certainly we as a network, like, ask ourselves a lot of questions on how effective our advocacy work has been or is in the current context. How can we change and adapt to what is needed right now to bring like the perspective of rights holders particularly. And interestingly, when I was listening like to many of you, to all of you, I noticed that there are many not so many differences, but actually like very common threads. And I think that is because we face similar challenges. Like why there is no one UN that you can speak about, like when it comes to CSO engagement, because the minutes that you get vary, or if there's a ticket system in place for you to access like a room, or if there is actually one person from the UN dealing with CSO engagement, or if there are three, obviously that makes a difference like to our participation, but it's not like the make or break issue, I would say. And I think that also builds a little bit on what Stefano was pointing to. I think like when it comes to the differences, you pretty much go down to the, what was the name you were using? Multi-stakeholderism. So I could give you plenty of examples on how that is actually handled differently in different UN contexts. And interestingly, that depends a lot on who's actually your UN liaison person. So certainly like there's room for improvement in any and every UN processes with regard like to the opportunities that we get, to how we coordinate, if we have space like to organize actually press conferences, if that's not permitted. But as I said, like this is all potentially minor compared like to the bigger challenge that we actually across UN systems face. And yeah, also taking into consideration that the UN is being considered already one of the best spaces for civil society to actually raise their voice and influence. So when I was preparing for the intervention, I thought like I should yeah, not speak so much about like the difference here, because it will end up like yeah, comparing minutes and comparing yeah, ticket systems and so ever, but rather actually like yeah, should also put out like some ideas on how we can yeah, overcome maybe some of the differences that we have as civil society to speak with one voice, and not only in one specific space, but across different UN systems, which will in the end then hopefully lead like to a stronger system like for inclusion across the board. And yeah, I think you get the idea that all UN processes have an intergovernmental agreed framework for us to participate. And I think that is one of the first problems that we have. Like most of these intergovernmental agreed frameworks have been actually agreed without our participation or marginal participation, and have been reduced like by on purpose potentially to the question of multi-stakeholderism, and not so much like on how we actually see effective our effective participation. And I think like reflecting just on the moment we are in, I think we'll have like another huge opportunity right now with the whole discussion on virtual engagement, and to make sure that we coordinate as civil society on principles to be upheld, like when it comes to virtual participation, and yeah, that across the UN actually we advocate for. So I'm really excited about like this cross-fertilization that happens between different UN processes. And particularly the coordination, yeah, that is ongoing across different CSO networks, right holder, engagement group, constituencies, caucuses, whatever they name us or we name ourselves. So I'm really think we have a huge opportunity here to shape and influence like the policies that will define on how space for us looks like in the future virtually. I think there are also huge risks because obviously right now discussion on virtual negotiations are ongoing in every space. I think like we'll obviously have like at least like another 6 months of virtual engagement because of the pandemic. And I think the sooner we can organize ourselves, like the better. In CAN, we are coordinating right now on principles, and yeah, while we acknowledge that, yeah, there is no win-win right now. I think like the more yeah, I heard you, wait, OBC, sorry, I'm potentially pronouncing your name wrong, but on yeah, talking about the opportunities that exist, I think like, I mean, for us right now, it's really like we are in damage control mode, because it's there are no good mechanisms yet, like for CSO engagement beyond multi-stakeholderism, because we haven't established other ways of doing advocacy, yeah, in a very meaningful and good way. So I think like there is, yeah, much more dialogue required amongst ourselves, not only on the principles, but also what are we collectively doing if these principles are not being upheld, and not only in the space that we fight for or fight within. So in my place, the UNFCCC, but how can we also like build yeah, bridges across UN processes and across like different rights holders, I want to say, and not stakeholders actually, like on how we can support like to uphold these principles across the UN framework. So I hope I answered your question, while I did go beyond what you said, Sarah, to also reflect a little bit on what other speakers and have been saying. But I really, yeah, I look forward to continue these conversations. And I will end by saying that most of the time, and I think that's a particular challenge that we face in CAN, and might be very similar to what you face in your own organizations, there is no space actually, or little time like for NGOs to spend reflecting on our engagement in the UN. And I think we often take what we get, as Stefano also said, because otherwise like we would potentially have no opportunity to speak. But I think we're at this crucial moment of time, and it's not a luxury like to talk about civil society participation. It's really like a necessity, like to change the paradigm and to change, actually to achieve what Annie said with regards to leaving no one behind. I think there is no other way of taking the time like to rethink on how we are doing things. And when I was researching a little bit like for this intervention, I noticed that the discourse around CSO participation like is not so old. I mean, it's not like this has ever been like that for the last 75 years of the UN. I think like we have CSO engagement for in a structured manner in the UN for the last 25 years, which is nothing. So I think like we are also have the responsibility to fight this fight for the system that is already in place. So just want to encourage us all like to think beyond and be more conscious about our role as well, like to defend the rights within the UN space and collectively. So thanks again for this panel and for giving me the opportunity to share some views.
Thank you, Lina. I appreciate your reflections, and I also really hope that this process will be part of us trying to exactly address those challenges that we see across the different UN meetings, right? And sort of try to come together with joint recommendations, etc. But we'll dive more into that when we go to next steps. But thank you so much for all of these really insightful reflections. And so I'd like to hear if any of the other panelists would like to add to Lina's points.
Yes, sir. Can I jump in?
Please go ahead, OABC.
So thanks a lot, Lina. And I think experience from my work engaging with the UN has shown the need for there to be some level of mental resilience on the part of civil society, because these meetings can be very, very mentally tasking. And just on a lighter note, so when you see civil society or government or business person sleeping in the room, you can't fault them, because it requires some level of mental agility for you to be able to follow through all of the processes, especially looking at the need for us to follow on post-conference implementation and also monitor that, including the capacity for civil society to be able to do that. And let me be the devil's advocate. For you to build that level of mental agility or the mental resilience, we must also now look at how we provide funding to local nonprofits in terms of their overhead. For instance, you want to send a staff that is able to quickly frame the words right, use the right languages, be able to sit and review documents and tease out statements, be able to quickly respond to questions that are coming from offices. This requires some level of critical thinking, analytical thinking, ability to engage, to think straight and all of this. And this doesn't come cheap. This is not an assignment you use a volunteer for. This is a senior high-level post that has to be well resourced. So I'm just putting that on the table to also say that while we have some of these processes, we must again now start looking at how do we provide that capability for civil society to attract the right talent, for them to have that mental agility to be able to engage. I mean, I remember while we were advocating on the SDGs, a couple of us, about 15 African policymakers left Africa. I know policy analysts and civil society actors left Africa. And we were in the US for like 2 weeks, engaging with Sherpas, engaging with ambassadors, looking at the document. And it was a lot of work, but huge investment. And what we have today is a product of that advocacy which some people invested in. And I tell you, at some point, you get tired moving from street to street. but that level of agility has to be well resourced and properly thought through. So while we're thinking to opening that space, when that space is opened at the UN, do we have the right skill, the right assets, the right staff, the right resources for us to keep that door open so that it doesn't get shut again? Over to you, Sarah.
Thank you very much, VC, for that point. Rosalind and Annie, do you have anything to add to that?
No, thank
All
you.
right. Okay. Well, I just want to really thank all of you so much. I've written down so many things that are both looking at really important inputs on the challenges, but also the opportunities, and certainly also several recommendations. And I just want to highlight some of the sort of key takeaways that I have noted down. And I see that the importance of seeing civil society as a key stakeholder, and also, as Lena said, rights holder, is really, really important going forward. And for that to be possible, there needs to be resources, capacity building, but also really a framework to ensure that this can take place. And so what I have also noted down is for this partner mechanism to come up where it's really all about equal partners also, and also looking at this throughout the year, and not just around the meetings, but looking at it prior to, during, and after. And then we also had the great suggestion of actually tracking civic space at the UN. So that there can also come some evidence into that, and we also heard a little bit about that with regards to Leave No One Behind, with looking at how different excluded groups not able to participate, and what is really also the resources that need to be directed to support that situation through frameworks. And then lastly, I think it was also important to look at the meaningful connectivity that OEBC also mentioned a lot, that there really needs to be the opportunity to engage. And for that reason, we also need to look at, of course, the challenges, but also the opportunities, and what then needs to be in place in order to really utilize those opportunities. And lastly, we heard also Lena's call for one UN, and really us to not necessarily see the differences between each other, but also what we can really do together. And so these are just a few things that I wrote down. There's so much more to take away from this discussion, and I'm sorry that I definitely couldn't do a proper job of bringing all of the really interesting points in that you mentioned. But we have this now recorded. I know I have colleagues who also have written it down, and so I definitely look forward to taking this forward together with you and also other colleagues here on the call today. Thank you very much for your time and for being speakers in this reflection panel, all four of you. And I have seen that several questions have ticked in the chat, which is wonderful. We will have the opportunity to go more into detail with those questions in around 10-15 minutes. But first, I want to introduce the next agenda point, which is very important. I think now we have heard from really great civil society inputs and experiences from civil society on how the inclusion works, or how it's challenged, and how also there could be certain recommendations to take forward. Now, I'm really pleased that the Danish ambassador to the permanent representation of Denmark at the UN in New York, Martin Bille, and also Rodrigo A. Carazo, the ambassador at the permanent representative of Costa Rica at the UN in New York, have both joined us here because they have both championed a set of recommendations coming from really important discussions that they were part of leading in the fall in light of the pledge, etc., that I referred to at the beginning of this call. So I'm very excited that our two ambassadors that we have with us today will share the important recommendations that they are launching today, and we will hear much more about that. And sorry, will it be you, Martin, starting, or will it? Perfect, wonderful. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for being here, Martin. Please, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Sarah. Let me start by saying it's great to be with you, and I know that Ambassador Carazo, Rodrigo, and I we're very, very happy to be able to join you today on this first webinar in what I think is a really, really important series on unmuting civil society. And the point, of course, is trying to find meaningful ways of including civil society at the UN, also in light of COVID-19, and hopefully also beyond COVID-19. And I think that of course always has to be the target. Let me take the opportunity actually to congratulate you. Firstly, I mean, this whole group of civil society organizations that are convening this series. I mean, I think the series will add more building blocks to the foundation that we're trying jointly to build. Now, in the true spirit of Sustainable Development Goal 17 on partnerships, we're trying to build in partnerships. Now we've been trying to build over the last year to enhance meaningful and active civil society engagement at the UN. Now, a year ago, almost in February 2020, the Secretary General launched this call to action on human rights, and he reaffirmed in that one UN's commitment to protecting and promoting civic space, reiterating that actually it's an essential prerequisite for sustainable development. It's an essential prerequisite for safeguarding peace and security, and of course for protecting human rights. Now, the subsequent guidance note that he issued on civic space, which was launched in October, to our understanding, actually further cemented the Secretary General's attention to the issue of civil society's role in the work of the UN. And I think these are important. These are important steps. Now, it's also clear that COVID-19 and also the virtual working modalities that is meant for us that work at the UN have further put focus on the challenges and opportunities for civil society to be meaningfully included in the different UN processes during the pandemic. But as I said, I think there also lies opportunities to be explored beyond the pandemic. And I think it's against this background that I have the pleasure, together with Ambassador Carazo, with my good friend Rodrigo, to present to you today sort of the list of recommendations on how the United Nations, in collaboration with member states and civil society, can actually further ensure meaningful civil society participation at the UN. Now, it's been guided by the experience that we had at the High-Level Political Forum in summer last year, and at the High-Level Week of the opening of the UN General Assembly, and following consultations with an input from civil society organizations throughout the fall of 2020. Based on these things, Denmark and Costa Rica, in collaboration, and I think this is very important to emphasize, with UN Foundation, with CIVICUS, with Action for Sustainable Development, with Global Focus, with Action Aid International and Forus, have prepared these sort of concrete recommendations for meaningful civil society participation in UN processes. And they're intended to support and build on ongoing efforts under the Secretary General's call to action on human rights. But I think also, let's be clear, that the work doesn't end with this recommendation, just as the work doesn't end when we pass resolutions at the UN. It only begins, and this webinar series, I think, is a great example of some of these sort of continuous efforts that are needed to continue to build momentum, to build on the momentum that's already been created, and continue to move the agenda forward. And with that was a very, very lengthy introduction, which had the overall purpose of actually handing it over to my good friend Rodrigo, to Ambassador Carazo, who's going to give you sort of a snapshot of the overall recommendations. Rodrigo, over to you.
Thank you very much, and congratulations to the organizers and the sponsors of this movement that have been cited by my dear friend Martin in the preceding statements. For Costa Rica, this is a fundamental issue. Civil society is much more than a stakeholder at the United Nations. Is much more than a resource. It is an integral part of the core of with the people, and we know that, and I mean we in this conversation know that, but we have to make it across the board for people to understand, to accept, and to put in practice that participation. In doing this, yes, Costa Rica found a natural ally in Ambassador Martin Herman and delegation of Denmark, and of course with support of the organizing entities mentioned already. We have been working in the putting together a group of recommendations that I will briefly cite due to the limit of limitations of time, and mention one thing to begin to start with. The Secretary General is in campaign. Is in campaign for being re-elected for the post this year. He will write a vision statement, and he will be in town halls here and there. And we know that he's part of this group, so as to mention, so why don't we pack, we do whatever is necessary so that the Secretary General feels the support of the group, as well as the expectations that the call for action be as loud as possible within that vision statement for a second term of the Secretary General. We pledge to do that together with all of you, and in the partnership with Denmark and its delegation. The points that we have in this strong set of recommendations are, and I will read them. First, maximize opportunities and advantages of communication technologies and digitalization in UN meetings and processes. That is already happening, unfortunately, by very natural means that have brought to the situation in which we are now. Second, bridge the digital divide. I mean, not only people. I was just at the process held by Wufuna, which was leading to a briefing by the excellent members of the Security Council with participation of a civil society. Of every 3 people that were speaking, at least one had to be of civil society. Well, but the reaction of one of the ambassadors is civil society is all of you here that have been sitting at the benches of the Security Council, and not necessarily with an outreach to the rest of society. So bridge that digital divide so that more people, more organizations from many different regions of the world and many different sectors can effectively participate in a meaningful way in all stages of UN meetings and processes that has been already mentioned, ensuring a real interactive dialogue during as well as in the preparation of and the follow-up of official sessions, and facilitating procedural conditions for that effective engagement. I feel very bad when they said at the end of the meeting, we are rushing, we are out of time, we have 4.5 minutes and 25 entities from civil society wanting to speak, so we'll grant 10 seconds to each one. That's not fair, that's not a way to get the people involved in the sessions, and even perhaps goes even further than that into a saying, all right, you will participate if we have, after we have done so. And yes, as one of the persons writing in the chat has mentioned, we suggested the appointment of a special envoy for civil society, it says, to fight for civic space at the UN. this perhaps following the very successful work done already by the special envoy for youth, and learning from the lessons there. And we also think it is important to suggest the creation of an annual civil society action day, for example, in the margins of the HLPAF or the General Assembly in September, in which authorities of the United States will have open doors to receive the manifestations of civil society. As a defender of the people in Costa Rica, I had the pleasure of asking the organizations to open the door to the people, and the results were great. Why don't do them at the level of United Nations and the organizations linked, the civil society organizations linked to them? Well, I think that I've taken enough time, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Martin, do you have anything to add to these really great remarks and the great leadership that we're seeing both from Costa Rica and Denmark?
No, as always, it's very, very difficult to add something when Rodrigo has spoken, but just to even though I am from the sort of the cold Nordic Scandinavian, but just to feel that actually for Denmark, we come with the same sort of almost southern passion, and you can continue on us together with Costa Rica and others to continue carrying the torch and actually trying to turn the promise of the UN Charter, we the people, into reality. No? So thank you.
Good.
Wonderful. Thank you so much to both of you. It is really great to see how you've taken the leadership on this important issue further with these concrete recommendations that you have drafted. And I know that both civil society and governments are invited to sign on to these good recommendations. And so for that reason, we will be happy to share them with everyone here at the webinar today, so that they will have a chance to sign on, so that hopefully this will receive a lot of support for all of us to really stand together to try and ensure meaningful inclusion. So thank you so much, both of you, for your intervention and your leadership on this.
Thank you. Thank you.
Great. Okay, so now we will move on to all of the really great questions that I have seen have come up. We have also received some comments and further reflections on different aspects of the points that have been raised so far. So thank you so much for that. We will definitely share those and add them to our notes. And then I think now we should just dive a little bit into those questions that you have posed. So first of all, I just want to take up one of the last questions that has come in, which said whether civil society should advocate for a specific focal point with high-level leadership at the United Nations to ensure meaningful participation. And the reason why I'm taking that up now is because that is indeed part of those recommendations that have been drafted by Denmark and Costa Rica to have a special envoy on civic space at the UN. So this is really part of those recommendations. So if you do support that, I think taking forward this list of recommendations would make sense. Also, I just wanted to say that we will share the list of recommendations with you and for you to sign on to them. As you can see, Ollie has also just answered the question regarding that. So this will be an online link that you can go on to and register your organization's name if you would like to be part of these recommendations that will be put forward. All right. So that was the first question. So now let's go on to the other questions, which we will then send directly to the different speakers. So first of all, we had a question saying, how can we ensure that civil society voices are not only serving as inspirational, but actually making a difference and being an active part of decision making? And so I'd like to hear if there are any of our speakers who has been talking today. This could be Lisa, Stefano, it could be the 4 speakers from our reflection panel, and it could also be our 2 ambassadors here today who could answer that question. So I see, Stefano, you have your hand raised, and please go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Sarah. I think I'd like to respond with an example more than a theory. And the example comes from the participation of civil society and indigenous people mechanism in the context of the UN Committee on World Food Security. So it happens in a context of a UN space. It has basically been the result of a reform of the role of the committee, but it's a good example because first and foremost, the committee is very clear in its articulation on its human rights foundation. You know, it's centered around the notion of the right to food in the context of human rights, and therefore it spells out very clearly the role that right holder groups, those left behind and very often most affected by development challenges, play into the process. And it's a committee that has a particular policy mandate. It helps to shape policy decisions, guidelines, policy recommendations on how to advance the agenda for food security, with a special emphasis on addressing, again, those left behind, but also with an active participation of the primary contributors to food security that currently are largely smallholders. No? So it's an interesting space because in the context of the CFS negotiations, the decision-making rests firmly within member states. So it's not a multi-stakeholder platform. It is firmly an intergovernmental space in which only member states have decisions. But at the same time, civil society participates through the entire policy process, from the decision in terms of how policy processes have to be shaped, in the organization of the same, and is able to speak on every single step of the process, not at the end of the last 10 minutes or last 10 seconds, as the ambassador from Costa Rica was saying, but rather throughout every discussion. Now, of course, ultimately, its propositions needs to be picked by one or more member states for them to be reflected in the text. But this is something that civil society also in the reform process really insisted upon, because it was very firm in the understanding that the decision-making role is that of member states, but at the same time can participate throughout the entire process with very concrete policy proposition, with text changes in policy decisions, and therefore it's an excellent model that should be applied much more extensively across the entire UN system. In fact, there should be much more education and information across the UN system on how that particular model works. Now, does it always work? No, because for instance, in the latest set of policy decisions just concluded a week ago, civil society walked out of the room and will probably reject the outcome. So I'm not saying that this is automatically a guarantee for success, okay? But at least we can certainly participate in the way in which decisions are shaped, processes are shaped, and we are recognized in full rights as a critical player and a critical voice with critical knowledge in the entire negotiation process. So I think rather than presenting a theory, there are concrete experiences that we can build upon and should become the new normal across the UN system on how we participate in policy discussions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stefano. Does anyone have anything to add with regards to that question? I think Stefano covered it very well, but of course I'd allow for anyone else to share reflections also. All right, well then let's move on to one of the other questions that we have received. So one question says, the issue of financial inclusion is a very important issue in terms of leave no one behind. We work in this area. Do you think there's enough work being done around financial inclusion? Would anyone like to respond to that point or that question? Please go ahead, Annie.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Just to say, there is no global framework on financial inclusion for the leave no one behind. Even in the SDGs, it talks about inequality reduction. It talks about the most vulnerable community indicators should be more than the national averages. But then it just does not say that, you know, financial processes or financial resources need to be tied into that. So it's left to the countries to work around the financial inclusion part. And I don't think most countries have a financial inclusion on an equity basis to really, you know, promote the development of these communities. It would be some level of affirmative action, some level of tokenistic social protection measures. It would be some kind of financial banking systems, but the principle of equity, which is so important for addressing disadvantages, are really not brought in. And I think it's a very important thing to look at financial inclusion and an equitable financial distribution that would help these communities to move beyond. At this point, we don't have a framework or a mechanism on that.
Thank you so much, Annie. Very good to hear those recommendations. And I just want to ask if anyone else would like to also address this important point. All right. Thank you so much, Annie. And then the last question that we have gotten is around COP26. And basically, the question says, in a scenario where COP26 would take place in a virtual or semi-presential way, we as civil society worry that our voices will be even more muted than normal, considering that in presential form, we are already not part of most discussions and decision-making spaces. How can we advocate to change that?
I guess it's a question that I could answer.
Please go ahead, Lina, and please put on your video if you don't mind.
Sorry.
Thanks.
I'll turn that off. Thanks for that question, because we are dealing with exactly that right now in the CAN network. And as I said, like for us, there is, I think this is a shared worry. And I think it's not only relevant like for the climate change negotiations. As I said, I think more and more UN bodies will actually look at doing either hybrid of virtual and presential, where the most likely scenario is that our participation will be cut. So I think like that's a very, very relevant question, not only for in the light of COP26, but really like for other important UN processes that are ongoing that will have an effect on people's lives and livelihoods. So how are we dealing with that particular question? Is actually to now work within our own network to set these principles that I was referring to. And this question gives me a good opportunity to maybe talk about some of these principles that we have come up with that others might want to build on, and really happy like to get feedback at later stage as well, like from more people who have similar discussion in other UN processes. But so what we are saying is that at a minimum, we need to ensure that no backsliding from regular practice of CSO engagement in the UNFCCC happens, like when it comes to virtual meetings. So as I already said, there are these frameworks like for every UN system. And within that framework, we already have like rules for engagement. So in the UNFCCC, it's very specified that we can speak at every opening and every closing session of a contact group. We anticipate that negotiation will happen in these contact groups. So our engagement is defined at least as a minimum basis already by that. So no backsliding is one of the principles. Ensuring proper notice and information of all meetings, as well as timely civil society registration, allowing civil society to prepare inputs for all sessions in a timely manner. That has been like something like that we have experienced last year with virtual engagement, that we get actually very short notice. We are not like giving the same opportunity to actually prepare for meetings, and that makes it more challenging for us, like to have meaningful participation and interventions, which makes it often see as if civil society has no opinion on these issues, while we do have actually technical experts for most of the agenda items. So yeah, ensuring proper notice and information is another principle. Providing opportunities to engage substantively, also in the preparation phases of the virtual negotiations. I think it is something that Stefano also had mentioned. It's not only that we want to see the agenda when it's done. It would be good like to be part of the agenda setting, discussions, so that we can already prepare, but also to make sure that an issue does not fall off the agenda for COP26. So really being part of the preparation right now. Ensuring inclusive virtual meetings. And I think, many have spoken to that, which implies taking into consideration issues such as access to the internet, time zones, and everything that, oh my God, I'm so bad with your name, and we have to connect after this webinar, OUBC, so I can apologize to you, but which you also spoke about. And then, internet, time zones, I think has been challenges that we also faced. Then ensuring support for those living in rural areas, women, young people, persons with disabilities, indigenous people in vulnerable countries, to have reliable access and the possibilities of engagement during the negotiations. And I think somebody put that in the chat as well. It's not only about having a reliable internet connection, it's also about having reliable power. So since we haven't done that much progress on the SDGs, like this is obviously like a challenge that we face with regards to access to power. So we see on how all these issues are actually interlinked, but there's another principle that needs to be upheld. And the last one, I know, Sarah, I have to be.
You really have to make it short, Lina.
Is that we don't want to set a precedent like with these principles or with any engagement for how then virtual engagement and hybrid solution or whatever look like in the future. And this is something like I think, we have been seeing in the past, like once, you have one slot, so this is now how the next 500 UN meetings will deal with the issue of virtual engagement. So I think it's another key point to make. But just to say, we are refining these principles, and we have to discuss as well on how we deal with this if these principles cannot be upheld by the UN in preparation for COP26. So if you are interested in connecting with me, I'll leave my contact there. And looking forward to
Thanks. Thank you so much, Lina. And I think that really is a good sort of move over to the last agenda point, which is exactly looking at next steps. On how we can work together on these really important issues and especially also the joint advocacy. So firstly, before I go on and move into the next steps, I'd just like to quickly hand over the word to Olli Henman from Action for Sustainable Development, who's a co-host today and responsible for also the technical backend. Thank you so much for that, Olli. And I'd like to invite you to just give a short reflection at this point.
Thanks, Sarah, and thank you to everyone. It's been an incredible panel and a fantastic session today. I also just wanted to thank the missions of Denmark and Costa Rica for their support on all this. I think you've already highlighted the collaboration that's been happening behind the scenes to get us to this point, and the real opportunity here to build on some learning and map out different models that exist already in different parts of the UN. I think some of what Stefano just highlighted, I see also in the chat, there's mention of the Escazú agreement and the processes around that. So there are so many different UN processes out there, some of which do already have strong mechanisms for civil society engagement, and it's really important that we work together to draw out those lessons so that we can then push for this clearer cross-cutting approach within the UN. And just one last thing to mention, I think from the Action for Sustainable Development side, I mean, we would really reinforce this idea that actually civil society is there because we have something additional to offer. It's not just that we want to demand a space from member states, but rather that if it's a whole of society approach that we need, there are so many groups that have expertise, that have the knowledge, as Annie has described, as Lisa has described, they are actually giving of their time and providing that expertise, which hopefully answers some of the big questions that we as societies need to address if we're going to come out of the pandemic in a way that really does leave no one behind. So looking forward to continuing the collaboration, and thank you again to all of the team who's been involved.
Thank you, Ollie, and for your really important work in also getting this webinar together and the collaboration on this. So before we end today, as mentioned, we will just go a little bit further into next steps. Before talking about the webinar series, I just want to highlight these recommendations as an important next step that we have seen from the presentations from the Danish and the Costa Rican ambassador today. Sorry, Caroline, if you can just go one step back. Thank you so much. So I just wanted to mention that these recommendations that have been drafted by Denmark and Costa Rica was shared this morning, and we will then share it after this meeting in a link. And then the invitation is there for civil society and governments to endorse the recommendations, and then they will be handed over to the UN Secretary General. And so this is, of course, a really important opportunity to come together to give these recommendations across civil society and across governments and also across different UN processes. So please do have a look at those recommendations coming your way and consider whether it would be something that you'd like to endorse. So now I just want to end with just highlighting quickly how we will move on from here from our civil society sort of core group side, from those organizations that have been organizing today's event. So if we do move on to the next slide, you can just see, so basically we would like to dive more into these recommendations on how UN member states and civil society can all be part of ensuring more inclusive and meaningful civil society engagement at UN meetings and processes. And so basically we will look at the recommendations that have come up. We will look at current best practice from different UN agencies, and we will also look at learnings and areas where the current practice can be advanced and leveraged. And then we will also look at dialogues which have already taken place within different UN processes. And we will, of course, then also dive more into detail with these recommendations drafted by Denmark and Costa Rica, and maybe try and detail more to see how is this actually possible and what is something that could be implemented more concretely in these various UN meetings that we would like to improve participation around. So if we go on to the next slide, we can just look at next steps. So we will have a webinar series basically, and this was the first kickoff webinar where we were trying to set the scene on what is the general issue on civic space, what's the civic space issue at the UN, what are some of the challenges and opportunities during COVID from different perspectives. And so this then brings us to a series of webinars that will look more into concrete UN processes. And so on the right here of the screen, you can see what these UN meetings and processes are that will be addressed. And so basically, if you're interested in taking part in these webinars and maybe also even taking part in how they should be set up, we invite you to be part of this. And what the UN meeting webinars, what they will aim to do is to look at that particular process. So for example, the Commission on the Status of Women, civil society will be able to sit together and talk about, okay, so what have we learned so far with the virtual inclusion? How can it be improved? And what are then, looking at the Commission on the Status of Women, some very specific guidelines and recommendations that we then have for UN agencies, member states, and civil society. So these webinars will give everyone the opportunity to look into the details of what concretely should happen at this UN meeting. And then we will, after all of these webinars have taken place throughout 2021, we will then have a closing webinar where we will extract the cross-cutting key takeaways from the different UN process webinars, and also, of course, extract from that concrete recommendations on what could be done. So we invite you to take part in this dialogue. And first of all, I think we just want to thank you so much for have taken this first step with us on the kickoff webinar. And we will definitely share with you any details on the further process. And we hope that you will take part and be joining us in really standing together across civil society, governments to call for more inclusive and meaningful participation of civil society during COVID at the UN. So thank you very much. Thank you to all our speakers. We really appreciate your very insightful inputs today. And as I mentioned before, today's webinar was recorded, and so we will share that with you, and we will also share the link for the recommendations as mentioned. Thank you so much. Take care, everyone, and have a good day.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye, Stefano.